The Subcommittee for Indigenous Peoples of the United States will come to order. The subcommittee today is meeting to hear the testimony on the impacts of climate change on tribal communities. Under Committee Rule 4F, any oral opening statements at hearings are limited to the chairman and the ranking minority member. This will allow us to hear from our witnesses sooner and help members keep to their schedules. Therefore, I ask unanimous consent that all other members' opening statements be made part of the hearing record if they are submitted to the subcommittee clerk by 5 p.m. today or the close of hearing, whichever comes first. Any objections? Hearing no objections, so ordered. Good afternoon and welcome to the first hearing of the Subcommittee for Indigenous Peoples of the United States in the 116th Congress. We adjusted the name of this committee to emphasize our renewed and singular focus on more than 2 million Indigenous peoples that we are charged with representing. As the only committee with exclusive jurisdiction over these issues in the House of Representatives, we have a great responsibility. As a body, this Congress can make countless improvements to the lives and well-beings of Indigenous peoples. And that starts here, in this subcommittee, where we will spend the coming months seeking solutions to address the issues these communities have identified. As a subcommittee, we will examine the significance of tribal sovereignty and self-determination, strengthen tribal consultation and honor our nation's trust responsibilities, ensure environmental justice for tribal communities, support tribal control of their own lands and resources, work closely with tribes to identify and protect sacred sites, uphold our obligations to improve the health, safety, and delivery of justice to tribal people, and lastly, ensure that all Indigenous peoples and tribal governments are treated fairly, as co-equals with dignity and respect. We have a lot of ground to cover, and I look forward to working with my friend and fellow Marine Ranking Member Cook, and the rest of my colleagues on addressing these and other pressing issues. Today, we'll focus specifically on the impacts that climate change is having on tribal communities. These communities are on the front lines of the climate change battle, and despite contributing almost nothing to climate change, they face some of the worst impacts. From floods and wildfire to drought and rising sea levels, Indigenous peoples face existential threats to the traditional way of life, including disruptions of subsistence hunting and fishing, as well as their commercial activities and tourism enterprises. This is especially true for tribes along coastal areas who are already seeing changes in their lands, including the Quinault Nation, whose people live on the front lines of extreme weather risks from flooding to tsunamis. These climate-related disasters are forcing Indigenous communities to make some very heartbreaking choices, like the Tohono O'odham Nation, who had to resort to FEMA for disaster support after hurricanes caused severe flooding, or the Quinault village in Alaska, who had to choose between relocating their entire community or losing access to safe drinking water. And these are not isolated incidents. Throughout Indian country, the effects of climate change are evident, and they are increasing at an alarming rate. I'd like to also remind us that all the challenges facing tribal communities are a mere microcosm of the larger climate change picture, and that the harms of inaction in Indian country will affect us all. Tribes are stewards of millions of acres of trust and federally recognized land that provide habitat for more than 500 endangered species, contain over 13,000 miles of rivers, and nearly 1 million lakes. They also house stunning national treasures like Antelope Canyon in my home state of Arizona that provide tourism opportunities for visitors from near and far, but are at risk of erosion and other harms as climate changes. That's why it is important that we work hand in hand to overcome the collective challenges that we will face. Climate change is ignorant of reservation boundaries and treaty land maps, and yet Indigenous peoples are often left to fend for themselves in addressing the issues that arise, and that's just not right. We are all in this together. The cultures, spiritual practices, and economies of many Indigenous peoples have already evolved to adapt to local environmental changes. This knowledge, accumulated over generations of historical and cultural connection with the surrounding environment, is integral to this committee's work. In my view, this makes us natural partners in developing a climate adaptation strategy, both on tribal land and for the surrounding regions. This committee's partnership with tribes to address climate change and other issues affecting Indian country starts today. To our witnesses, thank you for traveling long distances to share your experiences and educate this committee about the impact that climate change has on your community. I look forward to hearing your testimony. I hope that our members not only identify with your story, but also learn from you and your expertise as we develop ways to address climate change head-on. I now would like to recognize the ranking member, my esteemed colleague, Mr. Cook, for his opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. As the new subcommittee Republican leader, I look forward to what I hope will be a positive 116th Congress as we work to address the issues facing Native American tribes and Alaska Natives. I also want to thank the witnesses for being here today for this hearing. Access to natural resources can be a lifeline to prosperity and opportunity for Native communities. That's why this committee has focused in previous Congresses on providing greater local control and autonomy to tribes to develop and utilize resources on Native American land. It is my hope that this committee will continue along this path and avoid the temptation to erect barriers to responsible tribal resource management and use. Eliminating or sharply curtailing the ability of tribes to carry out resource extraction or development on tribal lands would be the wrong approach. These sorts of proposals would devastate tribal communities that have built their economies around oil, gas, and in some cases, coal resources. For example, one tribe relies on coal mining for 88% of its budget and will be left destitute by the new restrictions on coal production and use. Even tribes without significant energy resources would be hard hit by proposals that would increase the cost of coal, oil, and gas. Native Americans in the Midwest and Northern Plains who already pay a lot to heat their homes will be required to pay even more. Reducing the supply of reliable forms of energy would leave entire regions of the country facing energy poverty. For Native American communities who already face significant economic challenges, this result could be disastrous. Census figures showed the 2017 per capita income for Native Americans to be $19,824, compared to $32,397 for the average American. And the Native American poverty rate is 25.4 versus 13.4 for the rest of the country. The committee would do well to focus on innovative solutions to address pollution, promote jobs, and opportunity for Native Americans and Alaskan Natives, and lower and not raise the cost of energy in tribal communities. Today's question: how can we reduce pollution and promote a healthier environment while protecting checkbooks and job opportunities? Past opportunities, this committee has explored and passed legislation providing tribes with tools to achieve responsible natural resource management and conservation objectives relating to climate change. One of the best tools is scientifically sound active forest management undertaken by tribes with substantial forest lands. Tribes have proven to be excellent forest managers, creating healthy forests, removing dangerous fuel that contributes to deadly wildfires and the emissions of enormous amounts of carbon dioxide and pollutants. This committee should explore why the federal government has not implemented measures enacted by Congress to promote tribal stewardship, contracting in mismanaged or non-managed federal lands. When it comes to climate and energy, policies that impose a one-size-fits-all approach would not help tribal economies, especially when certain forms of energy are reliable or come at great cost to tribal members. Again, I look forward to discussing how we can find solutions and work together to improve the lives of Native Americans and Alaska Natives. Thank you. I yield back.
Still have my training wheels on. Thank you, Ranking Member, and I'd also like to recognize our committee chairman, Congressman Raul Grijalva, who has joined us today. Thank you. Now, please let me introduce our witnesses for today. And I'll recognize you, sir, when the representative. First, our original invited witness, the Honorable Fawn Sharp, President of the Quinault Nation, was unable to attend due to the weather in Washington State. But we are fortunate that the Vice President of the nation, Tyson Johnson, was already here in D.C., so he will graciously testify in her stead. And I'll also now recognize Chairman Don Young, Member Don Young, for the next introduction.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I was listening to your opening statement, and I was going to put my name on top of it. I think you copied my exact words the last time I chaired this committee. But I'd like to introduce a witness, one of my constituents, Janine Jordan. She's the government relations liaison for Chilista Corporation. She is an Inuit, and her family's from Unalakleet, and I'm quite proud of her efforts to try to bring forth messages from my native community in the state of Alaska. Yield back.
Thank you, Butch. Next, we will be introducing Dr. Shirley Buzzard, President of the Building Resilient Communities for Climate Extremes BRACE Institute. And finally, our last witness is the Honorable Verlin Jose, Vice Chairman of the Tohono O'odham Nation in Arizona. Let me remind the witnesses that under our committee rules, they must limit their oral statements to 5 minutes, but their entire written statement will appear in the hearing record. When you begin, the lights on the witness table will turn green. After 4 minutes, the yellow light will come on. Your time will have expired when the red light comes on, and I will ask you to please wrap up your statement. I will also allow the entire panel to testify before we question the witnesses. The chair now recognizes Vice President Tyson Johnson to begin his testimony. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the introduction and the opportunity to be here with you all today. I know President Sharp deeply regrets not being here since she's very passionate about this issue. My name is Tyson Johnston. I'm the Vice President of the Quinault Indian Nation, and I come to you today from Washington State, where my tribe is located in Southwest Washington. We are a treaty tribe, a signatory to the Treaty of Olympia of 1856. We're also a founding self-governance tribe and believe in the tenets of self-governance and self-determination. We currently manage 210,000 acres of forest and reservation land. We're also an ocean people, ocean navigating people, and co-manage natural resources in the ocean and several of our river systems. Our villages primarily support themselves from fishing income and natural resources related work. We also have taken a multi-layered approach to climate change because this issue has impacted our community very hard and first in many different ways. We've been talking locally with our state partners and now here at the federal level. We're a place-based people. We're deeply committed to our land. It's incomprehensible to think about having to relocate from our sacred lands that make up our identity. But because of climate change and the issues that faces, we've had to consider options. We've currently worked with the federal government to develop a master plan to relocate our village and essential infrastructure. This was funded in 2013 and fully adopted by the tribe in 2017, which has given us a blueprint to finally address the tsunami inundation zone that's up on the screen. We faced several challenges moving to higher ground. A lot of this is related to funding, obviously. We've estimated with our master plan that in order to fully implement village relocation and relocation of our infrastructure, it would cost anywhere between $150 to $200 million. Also, I mentioned earlier how we're a fishing community. We've had to declare several fisheries disasters that the best science and analysis that we've been able to look at have been influenced by the climate change factors of the ocean conditions, as well as it affects the terrestrial climates. Being so close to the ocean, the Quinault Nation is on the front lines of all the American people who are dealing with the negative effects of climate change. Ocean sea level rise has really increased. We've been dealing with coastal erosion on our coast and have seen that really speed up these last several years. But most importantly, I think the message I want to leave you is that this is going to be affecting more people along the coast, and this is really our time to come together and think about what are the best options to protect the American people and set up our future generations for success. We have taken many efforts, painstaking efforts, to mitigate this at our local level as the tribe, but we don't have the resources to fully implement that action without the support of our trustee and our federal partners. We owe it to our future generations to be bold, actionable, and decisive when it comes to addressing this issue. But again, I'm looking forward to the questions from the committee and offering expertise and support on behalf of the tribe to address this issue, not only today, but for future generations. Seal Queel.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. The chair now recognizes Janine Jordan.
Hello, Chairman Gallego, Ranking Member Cook, and distinguished members of the Subcommittee for Indigenous Peoples of the United States. My name is Janine Jordan. I currently serve as the Government Relations Liaison for Chilista Corporation, a regional Alaska Native corporation. Thank you for inviting me to provide a village perspective in this hearing and to discuss how climate change has affected Newtok, one of the 56 villages within the Chilista region. In addition to giving my statement today, I will be submitting additional written testimony for the record. I am Inupiaq, and my family is from the native village of Unalakleet, a remote community of about 700 people in the Bering Straits region. I am a shareholder of Unalakleet Native Corporation, my village corporation, Bering Straits Native Corporation, and Sirish Corporation. My regional corporations, each of which were created and mandated by Congress through passage of the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act of 1971, which settled our Alaska Native land claims. I am also tribally enrolled with the native village of Unalakleet. I am here to tell you that climate change is affecting Alaska's rural communities. Erosion is the principal threat to the habitability of many Alaskan native villages. This is according to the Army Corps of Engineers. The Arctic sea ice extent that protects coastal communities is melting, and as a result, waves and storm surges are accelerating erosion. This is a report found by the Government Accountability Office. As a result of coastal erosion, my family's village, Unalakleet, is considered one of the vulnerable communities of Alaska. Unalakleet has been adapting to climate change by building seawalls and raising roads. In 2010, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers spent more than $28 million on infrastructure for Unalakleet, armoring the beach with rocks and a gabion wall. Despite these efforts, my family, my cousins, and the neighbors in my community see the shoreline armoring being chipped away daily, and some folks have moved their homes from town to the hillside, which exemplifies a gradual relocation of Unalakleet to the higher hills in response to climate change. Throughout the state, local companies and Alaska Native corporations have pitched in to help communities battling erosion caused by climate change. Chilista Corporation, for example, through its subsidiary Bryce Inc., has repaired gabion walls and breakwater for decades for villages affected by climate change. We are currently doing work in St. George and at the Kivalina Airport in Alaska on this issue. We do this because we enjoy working within Alaska to rebuild communities in partnership with the state and federal government. Newtok, a coastal village of 350 people on the Bering Sea, is one of the first communities in Alaska to migrate to a new site 9 miles away, Muktarvik. Newtok is currently threatened by advancing erosion caused by the Ninglik River adjacent to the village. This progressive erosion, plus permafrost degradation and seasonal storm flooding, threaten the very existence of Newtok. Years of erosion studies show that Newtok must relocate because there is no permanent and cost-effective alternative for remaining at the current village site. According to the Army Corps of Engineers estimates, it could cost up to $130 million to move the whole village. Even though Muktarvik and Newtok are only 9 miles apart, relocation costs are high due to the fact that there are no roads connecting the two rural Alaskan communities together. In 2007, the state of Alaska created the Subcabinet on Climate Change, identifying communities in the most critical need of support. The Subcabinet's immediate action work group identified Kivalina, Kayakuk, Newtok, Shaktoolik, Shishmaref, and Unalakleet as 6 communities in peril. In addition, the U.S. Government Accountability Office identified 31 Alaskan communities that are threatened by climate change. Of those 4 were considered to be dire: Newtok, Kivalina, Shishmaref, and Shaktoolik. In 2008, I conducted a housing analysis for Newtok while as an intern at the Denali Commission. The housing analysis was a product of the Newtok Planning Group, which was formed with state and federal agencies and NGOs to coordinate relocation for Newtok. These are all generally outlined in the Strategic Management Plan, which is listed on the Alaska Department of Commerce, Community, and Economic Development's website. Many more specific plans are located there with information. Numerous federal and state hearings and reports have also been conducted on the relocation of Newtok. Stanley Tom, the former tribal administrator of the Newtok Traditional Council, testified on October 11, 2007 at the Subcommittee on Disaster Recovery, outlining the steps Newtok has taken to move. But their greatest need is for housing at the relocation site of Muktarvik. There is such a critical housing shortage in Newtok today that multiple families are living in a single-family home. The Cold Climate Research Center, a nonprofit organization that specializes in building Arctic climates, estimates the community needs a total of 105 houses in Muktarvik, 39 more than the 66 houses standing in Newtok today. Newtok Village Council and the Lower Kuskokwim School District received $1 million in funding from the Alaska Housing Finance Corporation to advance construction in Muktarvik. by 2020. The project will construct 2 state-of-the-art high-energy performance duplexes with solar photovoltaic panels. The duplexes will be the first housing constructed specifically to serve professional populations, including teachers, village public safety officers, and public health aides in Muktarvik. These grants address our greatest need, which is housing. Alaska's rural communities lack critical access to clean water for drinking, sanitation, and hygiene. The people of Newtok have been living without water or sewer systems for generations. So to address this need, the United Methodist Committee on Relief awarded $943,000 to Newtok to install 21 in-home portable alternative sanitation system PASS units in Muktarvik, Newtok's relocation site. PASS units are so innovative, they have low-cost alternatives to piped infrastructure, and they provide basic sanitation for hand washing, clean drinking water, and safe human waste. In conclusion, Alaskan permafrost, land that typically stayed hard and frozen year-round, has been melting due to temperature increases. Larger sea storms sweep the elevated ocean levels over the land and cause erosion. This leaves residents vulnerable to the sea. Infrastructure threats will pose an ongoing concern for rural coastal communities, particularly given the high cost of construction in rural Alaska. Alaska is indeed on the front lines of climate change, and it is affecting all of our coastal communities. There is a need of federal funds and bipartisan advocates to address climate change due to the federal trust responsibility that the government has with its Indigenous peoples. The funds already made available are just a drop in the bucket compared to the dozens of communities in Alaska that will eventually have to relocate due to climate change. Thank you very much for providing me this opportunity to testify on the impacts of climate change. Klianak Puck.
Thank you, Ms. Jordan. Now we'll have Dr. Buzzard speak.
I'd like to just echo my colleagues and thank you so much for holding these hearings and calling attention to this really urgent problem. The impact of climate change is enormous to the health and livelihood of many Native Americans, but most urgently, as you can see, for those who are living on low-lying islands and coastal communities. In May of 2016, Congressman Grijalva sponsored a forum on confronting the rising tide, the climate refugee crisis. Among those invited to speak at that forum were representatives of the Ile de Jean Charles Band of Choctaw, a gentleman from the Arctic Council, and people from the Embassy of the Marshall Islands. My company, Heartlands International, which is a Native American-owned small business, was honored to host our visitors to Washington and provide them with some food and housing. And so we spent a lot of time with them, and they told us that they desperately need an intermediate organization to help them understand the bureaucracy and the way Washington works. These are people who live on disappearing islands. They're not equipped to deal with the intricacies of the federal government or large donors. Even taking a few days off work, since these are mostly maritime people, just taking a day or two off work was a major hit to their income. So they asked if we would form a nonprofit organization that would serve as an intermediary between the groups that you've heard about and others to help them leverage funds, do reporting and accountability, and provide technical assistance for areas where they need it. In response to their request, we created the Institute for Building Resilient Communities for Climate Extremes, or the Brace Institute, which is a 501c3. Our objective is to provide support and technical services for the relocation of whole communities while keeping their cultural integrity. Initially, Brace is partnering with the following communities, which are populations of between 200 and 1,000 people that are going to relocate in the next 3 years. Primarily, we're working with the Choctaw and Ile de Jean Charles. We hope to be working with the Native Alaskan communities and also with the Quinault. Community relocation is a multi-sectoral problem. All of the communities mentioned have maritime economies, and if they move very far inland, they're going to have to learn new ways of making a living, including fish farming, greenhouse gardening, or other skills. As the educational level of the older members of these communities is marginal, they depend heavily on young people to lead the way. And the groups we've identified are only the beginning. As you've heard, all of the Alaskan coastal communities are going to have to move soon. Estimates that there are already about 14 million climate refugees in the world, and these are people who've moved to new cities or countries as individuals or families because of job loss, famine, and other climate extremes. There's really very limited experience with relocating whole communities. Responding to this urgent need, BRACE works with partners in the business and labor sectors to provide technical assistance and research. We partner with the Labor's International Union of North America on housing construction, and they also do job training skills in the construction trades. We have a partnership with Illinois State University in Normal, Illinois, to provide technical assistance in political, economic, social issues that come up, and also in terms of the documentation of what's working and what's not. BRACE is initially targeting these low-lying islands in the U.S., but we're learning from the Marshall Islanders who have moved to Springdale, Arkansas, as some of the health, so we understand some of the health and other issues that climate refugees face. Many of the Pacific Islands will be disappearing before long. We employ a classic community development approach within each community, which includes highly participatory methodology of helping people make decisions for themselves and building the capacity of communities to make their own decisions. We place emphasis on building leadership skills of young community members and women. And our multidisciplinary approach fosters a better understanding of the issues in both the origin and the destination communities, because with community relocation, you need to think not only about where they live now, but where they're moving to and what effect that's going to have on the destination communities. There are dozens of organizations working to mitigate climate change and postpone relocation by building seawalls or houses on stilts. All of these efforts are welcome, but they're short-term and often very costly. BRACE is the only organization that works with communities on total relocation and on the design of new green communities and with the assistance of learning new job skills. The main issues we're encountering on startup, of course, are funds, not only for BRACE as an institution, but to the construction of new communities. As you've heard—
Dr. Busser, please, can we come to a summary?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Anyway, we're grateful to be here and happy to answer your questions.
Thank you, Doctor. Much appreciated. And now, next is Mr. Verlin Jose from the Tohono O'odham Nation.
Good day to everyone. Good afternoon, Chairman Gallego, Ranking Member Cook, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. My name is Verlin Jose, and I am the Vice Chairman of the Tohono O'odham Nation, a federally recognized tribe with more than 34,000 members. The Tohono O'odham Reservation consists of more than 2.8 million acres in southern Arizona, one of the largest Indian reservations in the United States, and shares a 62-mile border with Mexico. Since time immemorial, we have learned to live in the desert and have adapted to high summer heat and scarce water. But as climate change has begun to disrupt our himmaduk, our traditional and modern ways of living, we have had to figure out ways to cope with these changes. The nation has 41 monitoring stations on the reservation to measure precipitation and temperature. The nation also took the proactive step of developing a climate change adaptation plan, which examines the impacts of climate change on the nation and its members and potential solutions. We appreciate the subcommittee providing this opportunity to address climate change, which is a significant issue for the nation as well as other Native people. As a result of climate change, it is getting hotter and hotter, and there is more drought across the nation's lands than we have experienced in the past. Arizona is currently in a 20-year drought. The average annual temperature is increasing as shown in the 2018 Fourth National Climate Assessment and monitoring done by the nation. The heat and the drought reduce forage for our livestock, food for wildlife, and the recharge of our groundwater aquifers. As a result of the dry soils, higher surface temperatures, and less vegetation, there is an increased threat of wildfires, and the wildfires are larger and start earlier in the season. The heat, drought, and fires put people, animals, and food sources at risk, impose greater costs on the nation to ensure the well-being and safety of our people. The day-to-day impacts on our members' ability to gather and use traditional food is staggering. Although we have not yet experienced the complete loss of traditional foods, the availability of these foods has been drastically impacted by the significant change in the average temperature that alters the seasonal life cycle of traditional plants. Our members go out to gather traditional foods and find that many are blooming out of season or not blooming at all as a result of climate change. As rising heat and drought continues, the nation will likely face increased challenges with respect to our ability to store food for our members. Currently, the nation stores food to distribute to members in need. However, we do not have enough cooling capacity to store perishable foods, and we have only 2 food distribution trucks to cover 2.8 million acres. In addition to high heat and drought, the nation also is experiencing much more extreme weather than ever before, such as intense rain, severe thunderstorms, microbursts, and strong winds. 15 of our communities have been impacted by 50-year floods. There are 4 communities within the nation where flooding is most severe. The nation is very concerned that if we were to see a 100-year flood event, these communities would be completely devastated. We are experiencing more changes in the rain, and while the annual average participation is less, there are shorter, more intense rain events throughout the year. For example, last fall, Hurricane Rosa dumped an incredible amount of rain on the reservation in a very short time. Residents of 3 villages had to move to avoid the extreme flooding. One village got 8 inches of rain in 6 hours, and a nearby dam almost overflowed. Following the intense flooding of our reservation last year in November 2018, President Trump issued a disaster declaration for the nation to assist with recovery efforts. We received FEMA funds to assist with repair of roads and bridges and for hazard mitigation measures to prevent further risk of life and property from flooding. The nation's climate adaptation plan includes the following core strategies: use traditional building knowledge and practices to make homes cooler, open available community buildings as cooling centers during heat emergencies, plan for flood mitigation, hire additional wildland firefighters, ensure groundwater is treated for more households, and educate community members about climate change. The nation will continue to take proactive steps to invest in climate change response, but the costs of addressing climate change are significant. Increased funding for federal programs and grants focused on climate change is needed. Increased FEMA funding for flood mitigation and firefighter support is a must. The nation and other tribal communities cannot fight climate change impact alone. Congress must live up to its trust obligations to help provide us with the resources to ensure that we can protect our members, our lands, and our annual resources. The nation sincerely appreciates the subcommittee's interest in this critical, important issue and the opportunity to share our concerns about the impacts climate change has had and will continue to have on the Tohono O'odham Nation. Climate change threatens to drastically and negatively impact the O'odham way of life. We are working to save it. We ask Congress to work together with tribal nations to address climate change impacts to communities throughout Indian country. Thank you for this opportunity to testify. I welcome any questions you may have, And lastly, I think if we address $30 billion to climate change, we might make a difference. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chairman. The chair will now recognize members for questions, and under Committee Rule 3D, each member will be recognized for 5 minutes. I will start by recognizing our overall committee chair, Chairman Raul Grijalva, for a first question. Sorry.
Thank you very much to all the witnesses, and indeed, Mr. Chairman, thank you for the hearing and the members of this subcommittee. It's historic, having a discussion about something that is with us already in many parts of Indian country, and certainly looming as an issue that has to be dealt with. And so I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, and the members for having this hearing, and the ranking member. Let me ask Vice President Johnston and Vice Chairman Jose a question that was alluded to in both your comments. The trust responsibility, the consultation, the responsibilities that the federal government has to tribes. How is, just for both of you, how is that relationship with respect to this particular issue working, and or what does it need to work better? If you don't mind, start with you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you for that question. When my ancestors signed the Quinault River Treaty of 1855 and later the Treaty of Olympia of 1856, they did that with the thought that our resources and our access to them would be in perpetuity forever, to take care of their families, the coming generations. That was their wisdom when they sat in those councils to create those terms. And now, because of the issues that we face because of climate change and the crisis that our communities are suffering, a lot of those treaty rights are now at risk. And so I think with a lot of state or federal agencies that we work with, there's inconsistency about that trust relationship. Some of them, I think, work or are touched by the issue more often. And so working with the Bureau or even working with organizations such as NOAA, they're educated to a degree on what the trust relationship looks like. I think what would help improve that is if there was consistency across the board, if all of the agencies somehow had that mandated as something that legally they need to understand what that relationship should comprise. I think that the trust relationship could always be better. You know, it's a two-way street. It's something that's living and is forming even today in the discussions that we're having in this room. And so, but I think from where I'm sitting from the emergency perspective, dealing with this issue, it's the consistency and the lack of understanding one agency has over the other.
Thank you very much. Mr. Jose.
Thank you for the question. Trust responsibility. I've been looking for that definition for a long time. I think it is a matter of interpretation. As the Tohono O'odham Nation, and I believe many other nations, look, we're not looking for handouts, we're looking about positive collaboration and working together. As indicated in my testimony, we have taken some proactive measures to address climate change. What tribal nations need when it comes to trust responsibility is a true seat at the table. I've often asked that question when measures are taken here in Congress. Who have you consulted? And the response is usually, oh, we have our experts who studied this and so forth. One of the things that I always say is that, well, your experts have never consulted with our experts. Those are the ones that are living there that face these issues. This is man-made, this has caused climate change. We really need to take a proactive measure at that and assist, as I indicated in my testimony, about addressing the issues, even to include wildland fires. We're more reactive than proactive, so trust responsibility needs to be improved. Have the nations have a seat at the table, have the boots on the ground, consult with the people in the area that is affected or of concern. Thank you for the question.
Thank you. Ms. Jordan, cultural impacts of climate change on Alaskan Native communities. Part of the question. The second part is, are we is climate change in Alaska a myth, or is it part of reality there? So both those questions, if you don't mind.
Thank you, Congressman Grijalva. Traditionally, Alaska Native people were nomadic. We were nomadic tribal people. And due to government policies, with boarding schools in particular in Alaska, we had to make our communities permanent so that we could send our children to school. Now we cannot just get up and move like we did in the past when we were nomadic. Climate change is affecting our subsistence hunts. Many Alaska Natives rely on subsistence foods instead of processed foods, such as seal, fish, whales, etc. When the ice is melting, we see that there's a decline in some of these populations, which affects what we eat. With respect to your second question, yes, we are definitely seeing climate change in Alaska. It does exist. We see it every day in our coastal communities. My aunt's house in Unalakleet was flooded just a couple years ago because the sea level is rising. It's flooding houses and destroying houses. And my aunt's house isn't even on the shore of Unalakleet. So it's changes in the sea. We absolutely see it. Thank you.
Thank you for your indulgence, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate it. Yield back.
Thank you, Chairman. I'd like now to yield Member Don Young of Alaska for a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I only have two questions. Janine, what is the responsibility, I think it was alluded to, the trust release, but the responsibility of the federal government in helping the communities in Alaska? I think there's 6 now that have to be relocated. What will be our responsibility?
31.
Well, we would say that it's a federal trust responsibility with our Alaska Native communities. These 6 communities that are considered dire are going to need funding. And as Mr. Johnston mentioned, there's a lack of coordination between federal agencies on funding and who's going to spearhead funding initiatives. Housing is an issue in Alaska to move our communities, and Alaska Native communities can't receive federal funding with respect to the Stafford Act. It's based on singular events like earthquakes and hurricanes, not slow-moving disasters caused by climate change. This does not fit into the Stafford Act. Therefore, Alaska Native communities don't qualify for federal disaster funds. So I would recommend a federal agency right now that can address climate change refugees in Alaska. McDarvik does not qualify for many state and federal agency funds because of housing, and entities that provide housing grants and energy initiatives won't provide those until sanitation facilities are built. So having a coordinated effort so that there's not the chicken before the egg. We had the Denali Commission, which helped substantially in the past with infrastructure in Alaska, and that unfortunately has not been funded, although it did get funded, I believe, $15 million a few years ago, which was used for New Talk. But the Denali Commission really did spearhead the effort to put infrastructure and help our rural communities. And unfortunately, there's no funding for it right now. Thank you.
Good point.
Mr. Chairman, I can thank you, Janine. I would say one thing. We ought to, anything we do, consider a funding program to make sure that we do address this issue, because very frankly, it's not the Alaska Natives' responsibility or their blame. And I don't know how many have been up there. The erosion is bad. And we might do a little better if we took a lot of this money that we have for meetings and discussions and everything else and put it into really solving the problem and adapting to it. You know, I mean, we might want to think about that too. With that, I yield back to the gentleman. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Young. Duly noted. Now I'd like to recognize Congresswoman Deb Haaland from the great state of New Mexico.
Thank you, Chairman, for yielding and for convening this important hearing. Thank you, Vice Chairman Jose, Vice President Johnston, Ms. Jordan, Dr. Buzzard, for taking the time to be here today to help Congress understand how climate change is affecting tribal communities. As I said yesterday in my response to the State of Indian Nations address, I'm committed to protecting our sacred lands, addressing climate change, and moving renewable energy forward so we can pass on natural treasures down to our children. I believe it's essential that we focus on environmental justice as we make this transition to reduce our carbon footprint, because all too often, the communities that are most impacted by our changing climate are the communities that are least responsible for causing the problem and the least well-equipped to adapt to the changes. I have a question for you, Vice Chairman Jose. The Tohono O'odham Nation is having an especially difficult time securing the federal funding it needs to respond to the devastation of Hurricane Rosa. This systematic breakdown follows a pattern set by Hurricanes Katrina, Maria, and so many others, in which underrepresented groups bear the brunt of natural disasters. Can you speak to the financial burden climate change has put on your community or tribal communities in general?
Thank you, Congresswoman Holland. I'm not sure if we can actually put a financial amount on the burden that it has on our people when it comes to climate change. It is changing our way of life. It is changing our traditional practices. Our traditional foods are off course and causes a lot of challenges to us, and due to our health, due to our medicinal purpose and so forth. You know, to address with the tropical storm Rosa, the nation spent over $4 million just addressing that. And even though there was a presidential declaration, we all know that it doesn't cover the entire amount that we spent, that we could have used for health, education, housing, infrastructure, and so forth. So when it comes to funding, I can't even begin to put an amount. If I start adding those up, and how do you put a price on changing someone's way of life? So it is an enormous cost and burden to not only the Tohono O'odham Nation, but tribal communities and the country in general, the world in general. And so I think we really need to be proactive and address those things proactively rather than reactive. And as I said, if there's an intent to spend $30 billion on something, well, why don't we put it to something that's proactive in addressing the challenges of climate change? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vice Chairman. I yield back my time, Chairman.
Thank you, and I recognize Ranking Member Cook.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. I'm sorry Congressman Young had to leave because he's got a lot of experience, obviously, with the tribes and the weather and everything else. He told me one time that he only will shave when it rains for 3 days in a row. Whether that's climate change or not, I don't know. But I'm concerned about this, partly because I have a number of tribes in my area and in Southern California. And of course, our big disasters that we're worried about are fires. And you've heard the news, and everybody's got problems like, we don't have a flooding problem because I'm out in the desert, but from flooding from the oceans. But we do have flooding. Right now, we've had a lot of rain, this and that. And I'm, unlike maybe perhaps some of my colleagues, I don't understand the whole thing. I'm always looking for data on how it applies. But I got to be honest with you, as a former mayor, I'm going to be, and I have a deficiency in my community that perhaps puts some of my citizens or tribal members in danger or affects their economy. I'm going to be trying to get money or funds for that. That's the only way we're going to solve that problem. And of course, this is where you have flood control projects. This is where you have the thinning of perhaps some of the forests so we don't have the fuel. So part of the reason my statement had that thing in there, I'm always going to go back. I am committed to changing what has happened in the past, where the tribes have so much poverty and everything else, and now they're being hurt even more. So that being used as an incentive, and I'll call on, I don't know any of the, but I'll ask Ms. Jordan whether if we created certain funds for whether it's called climate control or what have you, but certain economic factors where we could have a super fund where we could at least, we know that a dam has to, that's a bad word, I guess, but some kind of thing where you control certain rivers that don't wipe out settlements or villages or anything else. And I always was looking for a certain fund because I hate to use the term a rainy day scenario, but I think even more so than other people's because of past history. Something like that that could be used for these emergencies, however their cost. Can you comment on such a radical solution, perhaps? Ms. Jordan?
Thank you, Ranking Member. I appreciate the question, and I absolutely think that there should be a fund or an agency that can address and take on climate change directly. Unfortunately, with the example of Newtok moving to Muktarvik, many of the funds the estimates were $130 million with the Army Corps of Engineers, and I've done some math, and only about $46 million has been spent just to start the project of moving over to Muktarvik. That's just a drop in the bucket. They try to get funds from the Denali Commission. You heard in my testimony that they were trying to get funds from a church for sanitation purposes. They tried to apply for funds. They couldn't through the Stafford Act. They were actually denied FEMA funds.
Well,
so I absolutely agree.
Then do you think the federal government has been slow in declaring this a national emergency or crosses that threshold so we could get money for these projects? In other words, if I'm hearing this right, you want to see if this committee can use its power to expedite some of these occurrences to get the money and funds because somebody referred to the red tape and the bureaucracy. I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, but I'm just trying to gauge.
Absolutely correct, yes.
Okay. If, I see the gentleman wants the answer, so if the chair will.
I yield more time, 2 more minutes.
Thank you for the opportunity to respond.
generous.
Thank you for the question, Mr. Cook. Earlier, when you gave your opening statement, I believe you said one size doesn't fit all. And I think when you think of our tribes in the United States that have this special relationship with the United States, one size doesn't fit all. And if we had an opportunity to access a program like you mentioned that promotes self-determination and self-governance that allows us to really design what that would look like in our community, that would be most helpful because we know our communities best.
Well, thank you. And I just want to comment. I'm on your side on this. God, I hope I'm not on TV, but I kind of hate the federal government, okay? And I worked for it for 26 years, and I guess I'm working for it again. But I think everybody on the panel just wants to cut through the red tape when we have something like, and I'm looking for solutions, funds, or what have you, because I look at that poverty a line which has been contributed to, because of past history, and I want to correct it. So, I know we're asking you questions, but if you people are a lot smarter than I am, and anytime you have a solution on this, and I mean it's going to be huge, but if we can cut through that crap that is, you got to submit this document and 5,000 pages of this before we correct this, and this, and I think a lot of us here, even though we're different parties, we're looking at ways to help the people that we represent. And I'll be honest with you, you're the experts. And I yield back because I'm out of time.
Thank you, Mr. Cook. And I recognize Mr. Case from Hawaii.
Thank you, Chair and witnesses. And as this is the first meeting of this committee, my subcommittee members, I I bid you aloha from the Native Hawaiians, the indigenous peoples of Hawaii. The indigenous peoples, just as are you and as are the Native Americans and the Alaska Natives and the residents and the indigenous peoples of my colleague to my right. The Native Hawaiians, as with all indigenous peoples, were highly sensitive to the changes in our environment, in our weather, to the seasons. They could detect short-term, long-term changes and make adjustments. The Native Hawaiians in Hawaii had a highly sustainable culture of hundreds of thousands without any imports from the outside world, since they knew nothing of the outside world other than for the ancestral lands to the south. And they survived and prospered for generations and generations by careful land and resource management. They had a system of land management in which the land divisions stretched from the top of the mountains out into the fisheries. And in that way, in kind of pie-shaped structures all the way around the islands. And in that way, each of those divisions was able to manage from the uplands through the harvest lands and out into the ocean. And I can tell you in no uncertain terms, and you know this for yourselves, that had we been back in the situation of climate change 300 years ago with the kind of rapid change in our climate and with our atmospheric changes and with the ocean changes, the Native Hawaiians would have detected changes in the ocean temperature. They would have detected changes in the fisheries, in the corals. They would have detected a different growing season. They would have detected changes in the upland forests and the birds and a sustainable take from all of that. And so they knew these things as you did. And they would have, although maybe they wouldn't have understood the science as we understand it, they would have made adjustments. And I ask you this question in that spirit, and I'm going to just focus with you, Vice President Johnson, because you're talking about the ocean resources, and in Hawaii we particularly worry about, we have changes in our ocean temperature, we have changes in our coastlines, we have erosion on our coastlines, we have changes in our forests causing our native birds to adjust their habitat, adjust their habits. And we definitely have changes in our fisheries, and we are trying to find the ways to manage our fisheries not only through overexploitation, but through the impacts of climate change on temperature, on the feeding relationships from predators on down. So I ask you this, Mr. Johnson, you spoke a little bit about this, but in your management of your ocean resources, what, if anything, have you noticed in the last decades that you now may attribute to climate change in terms of the changes in your fisheries? Do you have control over your fisheries, and what are you doing about it from a management perspective?
Thank you so much for that wonderful question. The Quinault Indian Nation has adjudicated treaty rights 30 miles out on the west side of the border into the ocean. And we've noticed, even in this last decade, just a high increase of temperature. And this increase of temperature has allowed an influx of different things that we've been seeing: invasive species, deep water fish being in our area that we haven't seen before. We've seen domoic acids rise in our shell beds for our clams, for our different shellfish that we access. And so we've seen these changes happen at that macro level, and even working with our partner agencies in the federal government, we've been able to see conditions that are just not conducive to our fish going out into the ocean and coming back and spawning. It's been some of the worst ocean conditions that we've ever witnessed. We've had to declare 2 fisheries disasters within the last 2 decades. One was more recent in 2015. We actually just are mulling over the thought of calling in for another fisheries disaster for our prized blueback salmon that go into our Quinault River, a subspecies of sockeye.
Under your treaty rights, do you have the power to manage your fisheries in that way? Do you have full discretion over how you manage?
We have full discretion in a co-management relationship with the state of Washington. And so that's something that we perfected since the US v. Washington Bolt decision. But this has just become a new way of living with these new conditions. We're looking out for the best science, but also calling on our partners that work with us at the state and federal level to honor the indigenous history, knowledge, and science that we possess in parity with theirs.
Thank you very much.
Since we have nothing coming from my right-hand side, we'll move to Representative Soto for his question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for coming today. One of the primary functions of this committee, I've always believed to be to make sure to provide justice for so many indigenous peoples throughout the United States, and really to right the wrongs as best we can that have happened throughout American history. And when it comes to climate change, one of my biggest concerns relates to our history, that so much of the fertile land was stolen over the course of centuries, and many of our Native American tribes are on lands and areas that are more vulnerable to climate change as a result of that tragic and unfortunate history that we have to come to grips with today, and not just today, but in the past and now in the future. Whether it's desert or tundra or islands or mountainous regions or low-lying regions, so much of the areas that we're talking about are more affected, more vulnerable to climate change than other lands throughout the United States. I do have some hope in the fact that we'll have a $1 trillion infrastructure package that hopefully we will pass out of this Congress with bipartisan support. And so I guess my biggest question to each of you would be, if we were to include one specific project, major project, in this package to help you all combat climate change for your community, what would that project be? And we'll start from left to right, starting first with Vice President Johnston.
I think the one thing we'd ask for is the continued support and funding of our relocation efforts. We've put thousands of man-hours, dollars, federal grants to develop what a master plan would look like to revision our communities. So the ability to implement that effectively on the ground, driven by our community and our nation's need, would be the ask that I'd make.
Thank you. Ms. Jordan?
Thank you. I would echo that funding is absolutely something that we need for our communities. As I mentioned in my testimony, there are many Alaska Native villages that are seeing the real effects of climate change right now. It's just right at their door, literally, the ocean. So having a coordinated funding approach with a process in place that acknowledges that there are so many communities in need would be what I would ask for.
And then, Dr. Buzzard, overall, what would you, how would you recommend?
I strongly support what the previous speakers have said. I think the challenge is making those access to those funds easy, because as I said before, many of the tribal communities don't know how to access federal funds or don't really want to get into the whole proposal writing business. And so I think having an intermediary organization that can parcel out those funds, be sure that they're used correctly, and provide assistance where they need it, I think that's a fabulous idea.
And the current departments in place to do that aren't able to accomplish that function?
My experience is that there's a lot, I think we've already heard, there's so much overlap and contradiction in federal agency rules and regulations. All that needs to be simplified and made much more accessible to small communities.
Thank you. And Vice Chairman Jose.
Congressman, thank you for the question. I believe, and I echo the sentiments of the other witnesses here, and also echo and thank Ranking Member Cook about developing a super fund of some sort and to cut the red tape out, as was stated earlier, because I believe tribal communities, not only tribal communities, but communities and cities across want to address this, but the lack of resource, the lack of funding to do some of these things is a two-way street. It's not for the government to solve all the, but it's for the people to step up and address that. but there needs to be a better system to do it. There needs to be a better system so the individuals, the communities can address those funds and use them, because too often people put resources available, but they don't know how to fix the problem because they're not actually there. So I think, and that's why I mentioned a seat at the table, to really have true consultation on how to address those things. Funding needs to be available to take proactive measures to address climate change. Thank you for the question.
Thank you all for your input.
Thank you to all the witnesses. And Dr. Barger, I have a question. You stated in your testimony that community relocation is a multi-sectoral problem. Please expand on that and what it means to relocated communities.
Relocation is, it's a multi-sectoral thing. I mean, you have the economic issues of new jobs or retraining for jobs. You have the political issues of sovereignty. If you're moving into an existing city, are you going to be like a little reservation or what? Or, of course, when you get into things like the Pacific Islanders that are trying to buy land in Australia, what kind of sovereignty are they going to have? Are there going to be like reservations? There's been a lot of issues about sovereignty and political issues as these relocate. There's psychological problems because relocation is hardest, particularly for the older people who are used to traditions and customs, and all of a sudden they aren't able to do those, and they're exposed to a lot of cultural change, shock. There are health issues. The people who are most affected by relocation are usually the women, disabled people, and elderly. One of the reasons we partner with the university is that we can get technical assistance or we can get research to bring to bear on how to minimize these things from all directions. But moving it's not just a simple thing of packing up and moving. There's a lot of other external issues, not to mention the relationships with the destination community, because if you start bringing in people, foreigners, and plunking them down in an existing town, you can create all kinds of problems. We've been doing some research with the Marshall Islanders in Springdale and trying to look at how that's affected the situation in Springdale. But yes, it's complicated, and it's not a simple thing.
Thank you, Doctor. Question for Vice Chairman Verlin. After the most recent flooding on the reservation, a disaster declaration was issued by the administration. FEMA funds were made available to the nation. I think you kind of hit on this before. Were these sufficient amount of funds in terms of being able to rebuild the roads and the land previous to the states before the flooding? Were there enough funds actually to take care of the problem, essentially?
Chairman Gallego, Ranking Member Cook, distinguished members of the committee, there's never enough funds. There was never enough funds in the beginning. And that's why some of these disasters are very severe, because of lack of maintenance on waterways and roads that were already in deplorable conditions. And when you have the amount of water and rain that had hit the Tohono O'odham Nation in such a short time, the roads were easily destroyed. The berms, the levees that were there to divert water were totally destroyed because of lack of maintenance. And with 2.8 million acres of land, it is challenging for us to address those things because of lack of resources, equipment, manpower, and so forth. So to answer your question, we didn't get, and you know this, in any declaration, you don't get 100% of what you spend on there. So no, there wasn't enough. And I think that in order to address that, again, proactively, had we been addressing it all along, I think we could have mitigated some of the devastation that happened when you have 3-4 feet of water and mud coming into homes.
Excellent. Do we have any other questions for our panel? Mr. Case Chair.
Thank you. Let me ask a question that's going through my mind that may well be a difficult question. You know, we're talking here about climate change, which is an international issue. It really calls for international action, national action, local action, action right across the board. It's impacting everybody. And we had a testimony in another subcommittee of this committee this morning from the Appalachian coal community. And the question in that testimony was, how do we transition? How do we best transition in a situation where we've got to move from fossil fuel use over to renewable energy, and there are going to be dislocated communities along the way? And it was a very good discussion, but the relationship between the federal government and the communities of Appalachia is different from the relationship between the federal government and of the Native Americans and Alaska Natives. And the ranking member in his testimony made the comment that I think it was somewhere along the lines of we should not require tribes who are undertaking certain practices, for example, oil and gas and coal extraction. I think those was what he cited. Just to solve this problem. I know that's not exactly the way he put it, but that was the gist of it to me. And the question I have really is, if we have to move together to actually move away from fossil fuel extraction, how do we do that with the indigenous peoples and the relationship that we have when we all have to move at the same time? For example, what if we tell Appalachia, sorry, we can't do coal anymore? How do we then say to the tribe that is doing extraction of fossil fuels, you got to join the party? I mean, how do we have that discussion in the relation, the different relationship that the federal government has with you? Maybe Mr. Vice Chair Jose, take a crack at that. I don't know if I got the question right, but how do we all get on the same wagon here?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. I believe in order to get on the wagon altogether, it is about proactive measures in educating. When we talk about fossil fuels, we need to think about transportation systems that can work. When we have 2.8 million of land, well, back in the days, we used to ride horses, we used to run from place to place, and right now, look at the amount of cars that are out here, just here in the area. Maybe we need to develop systems that will allow us to move, without using fossil fuels. We need to look at solar, using solar and providing funding for some of those things. It is all about education and proactive measures, because this is not, climate change doesn't discriminate. It's going to affect all of us. And maybe the impoverished people more than anyone because of the lack of resources. So it's really about education. I believe that American cities and towns and Native communities are ready to do that, but the challenges are the resources. So I believe we can get all on the same page, jump on the same bandwagon if we educate and provide resources to do so.
Thank you. Anybody else have a reaction to my question? It really has more to do with the jurisdictional question. It has to do with the federal government's power and how the power is exercised in this particular case, where you're trying to get uniformity across the country in terms of a transition from one type of energy to another.
Thank you, Congressman. I did want to comment that I believe that climate change is an international issue. I used to serve on the Arctic Economic Council, which was under the Arctic Council, and the Arctic Council really looks at climate change as well as diplomacy with other Arctic nations. Our biggest problem in the Chilista region, we represent 56 villages, is unemployment. We have about a 26% unemployment rate. It's the highest in the nation, I believe. I work with folks that are some of the most impoverished people in the nation. So we need economic development to really stimulate the area because there's no infrastructure. There are no roads. It's tundra. People use diesel fuel to heat their homes and stoves. I actually manage a grant called the Chimay Grant under the Department of Energy, and we provide energy audits to those households and are measuring how high and how costly it is to have energy out in rural Alaska. And it's because there's no infrastructure, there's none, and there's no jobs. So for us, economic development is very, very important, and we do use fossil fuels because that is what is available. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Again, thank you to all our panelists. Thank you to all the members that have attended. We'll be moving to a closing statement. I hope we've all gained some valuable insights into the real-world effects of climate change on Indigenous peoples and their communities, and what they are doing to combat and adapt to those impacts. However, tribes are wrongly shouldering too much of the burden on this front. The federal government must live up to its trust responsibility and provide the resources the tribe deserve to address climate change impacts. In the meantime, as we heard, tribes are often left scrambling to patch together funds from various state and federal grants and to dig deep into their own pockets. I know there are proposals already offered by my colleagues that would start to address these issues, and I hope that we can work together to advance real legislative solutions to what we have heard today. In closing, let me again thank the witnesses for their valuable testimony and time, and the members for their questions. The members of this committee may have some additional questions for the witnesses, and we will ask you to respond to those in writing. Under Committee Rule 3.0, is that 0 or 0? Oh, sorry guys, still have the training wheels. Members of the committee must submit witnesses within 3 business days following the hearing, and the hearing record will be held open for 10 business days for these purposes and for the responses. If there's no further business, without objection, the committee stands adjourned.